The message came through on the most secure channel in the galaxy. Deep in the shadow realm between dying stars, Veltak felt his communication device buzz with the special tone reserved for only the biggest jobs. His scaled fingers trembled slightly as he activated the holographic display, and what he saw made all 6 of his eyes widen in complete shock. The number floating in front of him was beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Not just enough credits to live comfortably for the rest of his very long life, but enough to purchase entire solar systems. Enough to become a galactic power player himself. The kind of money that made even seasoned killers like him pause and wonder what kind of impossible target could be worth this much. Veltak had been in the assassination business for over 2 centuries. He'd seen contracts for war criminals, corrupt politicians, crime lords, and even a few minor royalty. But nothing had ever come close to this payday. His reputation in the guild was legendary. Other assassins whispered his name in the dark corners of space stations, telling stories of his impossible kills and perfect record. The target file loaded slowly, building suspense that made Veltak's hearts race. He expected to see some kind of super soldier, maybe a cybernetically enhanced warlord, or perhaps one of those telepathic beings who could read minds from across star systems. What appeared on his screen instead made him blink repeatedly, certain there had been some kind of mistake. Li Jin, human male, age 43 standard years, occupation, diplomat, current assignment, peace negotiations at Nexus Prime Neutral Station. That was it. No list of dangerous abilities, no record of military service, no cybernetic implants or genetic modifications. The photograph showed a perfectly ordinary-looking being with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The sort of face you'd expect to see teaching children or tending a garden, not someone worth the biggest assassination contract in galactic history. Veltak scrolled through the intelligence report, growing more confused with each line. Earth was listed as a recently discovered world on the outer rim of known space. The planetary classification read Garden World, the kind of soft, comfortable place that bred soft, comfortable inhabitants. Rolling hills, blue skies, abundant water. It sounded like a vacation destination. The cultural notes were equally puzzling. Humans were described as generally peaceful, with a tendency toward cooperation and diplomacy. They had only recently developed space travel and seemed eager to make friends with other species. Their technology was basic, their military virtually non-existent. They grew plants for pleasure and kept small animals as companions. Everything about this target screamed easy kill. So why was someone willing to pay enough credits to fund a small war just to eliminate one harmless diplomat? Veltak's curiosity was matched only by his greed. He'd been planning to retire after his next big score, and this was definitely big enough. One quick job, collect an unimaginable fortune, then disappear to some comfortable world where he could live like a king. For the rest of his days, he accepted the contract with a swift claw stroke across his communicator. The confirmation came back immediately, along with detailed travel arrangements and a single strange instruction. Make the death look completely natural. No evidence, no witnesses, no indication that humans could be killed at all. That last part puzzled him, but Veltak had learned not to question his client's odd requests. Maybe they wanted to avoid starting some kind of diplomatic incident. Maybe they were planning something bigger. It didn't matter. His job was simple. Get to Nexus Prime, find Li Jin, eliminate him quietly, and collect the biggest payday in assassination history. As his ship's engines powered up for the journey, Veltak allowed himself a rare smile. After all these years of dangerous, complicated kills, the universe was finally giving him an easy one. Veltak arrived at Nexus Prime 3 days before the peace negotiations were scheduled to begin. He'd done this dance hundreds of times before. Find the target, study their habits, locate the perfect moment to strike. It was almost boring how predictable most beings were in their daily routines. Ambassador Li Jin seemed to follow the same pattern as every other diplomat Veltak had ever hunted. The human woke at the same time each morning, ate breakfast in the same cafe, and spent his afternoons in the diplomatic offices reviewing endless stacks of documents. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, Just another soft politician doing soft politician things. Velthak positioned himself in the observation deck overlooking the diplomatic quarters, using his natural camouflage abilities to blend into the shadows. From this vantage point, he could watch Lee's every movement without being detected. The plan was simple: memorize the human's schedule, identify the moment when he'd be most vulnerable, then strike with surgical precision. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly as expected. Lee followed his routine like clockwork. He was polite to everyone he met, always smiling, always saying please and thank you. The kind of painfully nice individual that made Velthak's job almost feel like a mercy killing. Then the impossible began. It started with something so small that Velthak almost missed it. Lee was in his temporary office reading through treaty documents when he stood up to stretch. The human took a step backward without looking, bumping into the reinforced transparisteel wall that separated his office from the corridor. Velthak expected to see Lee bounce off the barrier like everyone else did. Transparisteel was military-grade material, designed to withstand direct hits from plasma weapons. Instead, he watched in growing confusion as spiderweb cracks spread across the entire panel from the point where Lee's shoulder had made contact. The human turned around, noticed the damage, and actually apologized to the wall. "Sorry about that," Lee said cheerfully, as if talking to a living being. "Didn't mean to bump into you." Then he simply turned back to his work, as if accidentally shattering supposedly unbreakable materials was something that happened every day. Velthak rubbed his eyes, wondering if the station's artificial atmosphere was affecting his vision. Transparisteel didn't crack from casual contact. It was scientifically impossible, yet there it was, damaged beyond repair by what looked like nothing more than a gentle bump. The second incident happened later that same day. Lee had dropped his stylus while reviewing documents, and the writing instrument had rolled under a malfunctioning cargo lifter in the hallway. These machines were industrial-grade equipment designed to move supplies that weighed several tons. The broken unit had settled into place and would normally require a full maintenance crew with proper lifting equipment to move. Velthak watched through his scope as Lee approached the massive machine, bent down slightly, and simply picked it up with one hand. Not lifted with both hands using proper technique, not struggled and strained to move it, just casually grabbed it and moved it aside like it was a piece of furniture, humming a pleasant tune while he retrieved his stylus. The cargo lifter had warning labels plastered all over it, indicating its weight and the danger of attempting to move it manually. Lee either couldn't read the warnings or didn't care. He set the machine back down gently, making sure it was positioned safely, then continued on his way, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. By this point, Velthak was beginning to question his own sanity. Maybe the long journey through hyperspace had affected his brain. Maybe he was hallucinating. But the third incident removed all doubt that something very strange was happening. A maintenance accident in the corridor caused a plasma conduit to rupture, sending a stream of superheated metal spraying across the walkway. Velthak watched other beings dive for cover, knowing that even brief contact with that material would cause severe burns or death. Lee's reaction was pure instinct. Without thinking, he reached out and caught the molten metal in his bare palm, holding it just long enough to redirect the spray away from a group of passing civilians. Then he released it with a mild ouch and immediately began asking if anyone had been hurt. Velthak stared through his scope at Lee's hand. There should have been severe burns, maybe even permanent damage. Instead, the human's palm looked perfectly normal. Not even a red mark where the superheated metal had made contact. Around the station, Velthak began noticing something else. Other inhabitants were giving Lee a wide berth, stepping aside when he approached, speaking in hushed whispers when he passed. He caught fragments of conversations about Deathworlders and gravity dwellers and impossible strength. For the first time in his long career, Velthak began to wonder if he'd taken on more than he could handle. The diplomatic dinner was perfect for Velthak's purposes. The grand ballroom of Nexus Prime was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all mingling and making small talk, while servers moved between tables carrying exotic foods from across the galaxy. The noise level was high enough to mask any small sounds, and the crowd provided excellent cover for a quick escape. Velthak had spent hours studying the room's layout. He knew every entrance, every exit, every ventilation shaft and maintenance tunnel. His species had evolved as ambush predators, and patience was literally built into his DNA. He could wait motionless for hours if necessary, completely invisible to most beings' eyes. The plan was simple and elegant. Li Jin was scheduled to give a speech about interspecies cooperation, something boring and diplomatic that would put half the audience to sleep. During the applause, when everyone's attention was focused on the podium, Velthak would strike from the shadows behind the speaking platform. His venom was legendary throughout the criminal underworld. The paralytic compound produced by his species could drop a Taurian warbeast in seconds. Just a single drop was enough to kill most beings instantly. Velthak had prepared enough toxin to eliminate a dozen targets, ensuring that even if Li had some kind of unusual resistance, the massive dose would overwhelm any natural defenses. As Li approached the podium, Velthak felt the familiar calm that came before a kill. This was the moment he lived for, the perfect intersection of planning, skill and execution. In 30 seconds, the human would be dead, and Velthak would be the richest assassin in galactic history. Li began his speech with the usual diplomatic pleasantries, thanking everyone for attending and expressing hope for peaceful relations between all species. His voice was warm and friendly, the kind of tone that made people want to trust him. It was almost a shame to kill someone who seemed so genuinely nice, but business was business. The moment came exactly as Velthak had planned. As Li reached the section of his speech about mutual cooperation, the assassin struck with lightning precision. His retractable stinger extended from his wrist, delivering a massive dose of venom directly into the human's neck. The strike was so quick and subtle that no one in the audience would notice until Li collapsed. Velthak immediately began his retreat, moving silently toward the nearest ventilation shaft. In 10 seconds, the toxin would shut down Li's nervous system. In 20 seconds, his heart would stop. In 30 seconds, the human would be dead, and Velthak would be gone without a trace. But 30 seconds passed, and Li was still talking. Velthak froze in the shadows, staring at his target in growing confusion. The human had paused briefly in his speech, touched his neck where the stinger had made contact, and mentioned feeling slightly under the weather today. Then he'd simply continued his presentation, as if nothing had happened. The venom that had never failed to kill should have dropped Li instantly. Instead, it seemed to have the same effect as a mild cold. The human yawned once, actually yawned during his own diplomatic speech, then kept talking about trade agreements and cultural exchange. Panic began to set in as Velthak realized his perfect plan had somehow failed catastrophically. He needed to escape immediately and figure out what had gone wrong. The ventilation shaft was only 20 feet away, hidden behind a decorative pillar. He could reach it in seconds and be gone before anyone realized what had happened. He made it exactly 3 steps before impossibly strong fingers wrapped around his throat. Velthak hadn't heard Li move, hadn't seen him leave the podium. One moment the human was giving his speech 30 feet away. The next moment, he was holding Velthak in a grip that felt like it could crush steel. The assassin's natural camouflage abilities meant nothing. Somehow Li had spotted him instantly in the shadows, but what terrified Velthak most wasn't the inhuman speed or the crushing strength. It was the expression on Li's face. There was no anger, no awareness that he'd just survived an assassination attempt. Only genuine concern and kindness. "You look really unwell," Li said softly, his voice filled with authentic worry. "Your skin color seems off, and you're trembling. Should I call for medical assistance? I know the artificial atmosphere on these stations can be hard on some species. Different oxygen levels, artificial gravity. It affects everyone differently." Velthak stared into the human's eyes, searching for any sign of deception or hidden knowledge. All he saw was sincere concern for his well-being. Li had somehow detected and stopped a professional assassination attempt, yet he genuinely seemed to think Velthak was just a sick being who needed help. "I really think you should see a doctor," Li continued, his grip loosening slightly, but still maintaining perfect control. "You don't look well at all. Are you having trouble breathing? Chest pains?" The medical bay here has specialists from dozens of species. For the first time in 2 centuries of killing, Velthak found himself completely speechless. He'd just delivered enough poison to kill a small army, and his target was offering to call him a doctor. Velthak's hands were still shaking as he sealed himself inside his ship's secure communications chamber. The encounter with Li Jin had left him more rattled than any job in his entire career. Something was fundamentally wrong with the intelligence he'd been given, and he needed answers before he attempted another approach. Using his guild access codes, he began digging deeper into the restricted databases that most beings never saw. The initial search for Earth and humans returned the same basic information he'd already reviewed. Peaceful garden world, newly discovered species, diplomatically inclined. But Velthak had learned to look beyond surface-level reports. He started cross-referencing environmental data, biological surveys, and planetary classification records. The deeper he dug, the more confused he became. The numbers didn't match the description. Garden worlds were supposed to be gentle, comfortable places, but Earth's gravity readings were massive, nearly 3 times what most spacefaring species considered normal. That couldn't be right. Velthak ran the calculations, again certain there had been some kind of error. But the data was consistent across multiple independent surveys. Humans lived their entire lives under crushing gravitational force that would flatten most beings within minutes. The atmospheric analysis was even more disturbing, 21% oxygen content. Velthak stared at that number in disbelief. Most civilized worlds maintained oxygen levels around 8 to 12%. Anything above 15% was considered dangerously flammable. The humans were literally breathing an atmosphere that could explode at any moment, but that was just the beginning. As Velthak accessed more classified files, the picture became increasingly horrifying. Earth wasn't classified as a garden world at all. Deep in the restricted military databases, he found its true designation, Class 12, the Deathworld. He'd heard whispers about Deathworlds in the darkest corners of space, planets so hostile, so utterly lethal, that the Council had assumed no intelligent life could possibly survive there, let alone evolve. These were worlds where the very air was poison, where the gravity crushed bones, where predators ruled every ecosystem. The biological surveys made his blood run cold. Humans hadn't evolved as peaceful plant-eaters on some comfortable world. They were descended from persistent predators, creatures that hunted by literally running their prey to death. Their ancestors would follow target animals for days, weeks even, never stopping, never resting until their victims collapsed from pure exhaustion. Even worse, they still did this. The files showed images of humans engaged in something called marathon running, voluntarily chasing each other across vast distances for what they called fun. They had turned their ancestral hunting technique into recreational activity. The recreational activities section read like a catalogue of elaborate suicide methods. Mountain climbing involved deliberately ascending vertical rock faces using only their hands and feet, apparently for enjoyment. Swimming meant voluntarily submerging themselves in liquid and staying underwater for extended periods. They had something called skydiving, where they threw themselves out of aircraft at high altitude, trusting thin fabric to prevent their deaths. But perhaps most disturbing were the images in the cultural section. Humans shared their living spaces with creatures that would be classified as dangerous predators on any civilized world. The files showed them cohabitating peacefully with animals that had massive teeth, powerful claws, and predatory instincts. They called these deadly creatures pets and seemed to care for them like family members. One image showed a human child sleeping peacefully next to what appeared to be a large carnivorous animal. The creature could have killed the child effortlessly, but instead seemed to be protecting it. The caption read, "Typical human canine bonding behavior." Velthak scrolled through dozens of similar images, each more incomprehensible than the last. Humans riding on the backs of massive four-legged creatures. Humans hand-feeding animals with razor-sharp teeth. Humans playing with creatures that looked like miniature versions of apex predators. Then he found the notation, that made his 3 hearts stop beating entirely. Buried deep in the diplomatic files was a special warning marked with the highest security clearance. Critical. Humans have been observed to become emotionally attached to other species during extended contact. This emotional investment appears to make them significantly more protective and therefore more dangerous. Under no circumstances should human emotional responses be underestimated or dismissed. The file included combat footage from a border dispute where human peacekeepers had been protecting a refugee camp. When the camp came under attack, the humans had transformed from gentle diplomats into something that defied description. The Taiti. Footage showed them moving with impossible speed and strength, single-handedly fighting off armed forces that outnumbered them 50-1. The final line of the report was highlighted in red. Recommendation: any species or organization considering hostile action against human-protected interests should reconsider. The risk of retaliation is beyond calculation. Velthak sat back in his chair, finally understanding why this contract paid so much. Li Jin wasn't just a diplomat. He was a walking catastrophe wrapped in a friendly smile, a creature evolved on a world that would kill most beings just by existing there. And now Velthak had tried to poison him. Worse yet, Li seemed to genuinely like him. The emergency meeting at Guild headquarters was unlike anything in their 1,000-year history. Velthak's report had landed like a bomb in the highest levels of the organization, sending shockwaves through every department. A failed assassination was bad enough, but a failed assassination where the target had offered to call medical help for the assassin was completely unprecedented. Guildmaster Thexvar read the report 3 times before he believed it. Then he read it 3 more times before he got angry. The Galactic Assassins Guild had built their reputation on one simple promise: no target was beyond their reach. They had eliminated war criminals hiding in black holes, crime lords protected by entire armies, and even a few beings who existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But now one human diplomat from a backwater planet had made their best operative look like an amateur. "This is unacceptable," Thexvar declared to his council of senior assassins. "Our reputation is everything. If word spreads that we failed to eliminate a single unarmed diplomat, every 2-credit bounty hunter in the galaxy will think they can compete with us." The solution was obvious: overwhelming force. If one assassin couldn't handle Li Jin, they would send 12. Not just any 12, but the absolute best killers from across known space. Each one was a specialist in different forms of death, chosen specifically to counter any possible defense the human might have. Zarketh the Mindbreaker came from the distant Psi Nebula, where his species had evolved psychic abilities that could drive victims insane from across star systems. He could shatter minds with a thought, turn enemies against each other with whispered suggestions, or simply overload someone's brain until they forgot how to breathe. Silvara represented the pinnacle of technological assassination. Her molecular disruptor weapon could reduce any target to component atoms in seconds. She had once eliminated an entire space station by disintegrating its structural supports, making the attack look like an engineering accident. The team included Korthmin, whose natural shape-shifting abilities made him undetectable until the moment he struck. There was Vexila, who could phase through solid matter and attack from impossible angles. Nixthora brought her collection of exotic poisons, including compounds that could kill beings who didn't even have traditional biological systems. Together, they represented enough killing power to topple governments. Their combined arsenal included weapons banned by 17 different galactic treaties. Some of their equipment was so dangerous that merely possessing it carried a death sentence. In most civilized systems, the plan was military-grade precision. Intelligence had identified Li Jin's habit of taking evening walks through Nexus Prime's industrial sector, areas that other diplomats avoided due to radiation hazards and dangerous machinery. For reasons no one could understand, the human found these deadly environments peaceful and relaxing. The Death Squad positioned themselves throughout the sector with overlapping fields of fire. Every possible escape route was covered. Hidden sensors tracked Li's approach from 6 different angles. Backup contingencies were prepared for 17 different scenarios. Zarketh would strike first with his psychic assault, overwhelming Lee's mind before he could react. While the human was stunned and disoriented, Silvara would follow up with her molecular disruptor, reducing him to scattered atoms. The other 10 assassins were positioned to handle any complications or provide additional firepower if needed. It was overkill on a scale that bordered on ridiculous. But the guild's reputation was at stake, and they weren't taking any chances. As the appointed time approached, the assassins settled into their positions like pieces on a deadly game board. Their combined experience totaled over 2,000 confirmed kills. Their weapons had been tested and calibrated. Their escape routes were planned and memorized. Then Li Jin appeared at the far end of the corridor, humming a cheerful tune as he began his evening walk. He looked completely relaxed, hands clasped behind his back, occasionally pausing to examine some piece of industrial equipment with curious interest. To him, this was just another pleasant stroll through what he considered one of the station's more interesting areas. The 12 deadliest beings in the galaxy watched their target approach, each one preparing to unleash devastation that could have leveled a small city. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would be whispered about in criminal circles for generations to come. As Li drew within range, still humming that infuriatingly cheerful song, Zarketh began charging his psychic attack. In 30 seconds, this impossible contract would finally be completed. They had no concept of how wrong they were about to be. The moment arrived with military precision. Zarketh's psychic assault hit first, a wave of mental energy powerful enough to shatter the minds of entire armies. Simultaneously, 11 other exotic weapons discharged their deadly payloads from concealed positions throughout the industrial corridor. The combined attack was beyond devastating. Molecular disruptors fired streams of particles that could unmake matter at the atomic level. Plasma cannons unleashed temperatures hot enough to melt starship hulls. Energy weapons discharged bolts that had once leveled mountain ranges. Exotic poisons filled the air in concentrations that could kill most beings just by breathing near them. The corridor filled with so much destructive energy that the station's emergency systems immediately began evacuation protocols for the entire sector. Radiation alarms screamed warnings that would have sent most species fleeing in terror. The very air seemed to catch fire as different forms of exotic energy collided and created new combinations of destruction. When the light show finally ended and the smoke began to clear, the 12 assassins peered through their scopes and sensors, expecting to see nothing but scattered atoms where their target had been standing. Instead, they saw something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their very long lives. Li Jin stood exactly where he had been before the attack, completely unharmed and looking mildly confused. His diplomatic clothing wasn't even wrinkled. The only sign that anything had happened was a collection of scorch marks on the walls around him, forming a perfect human-shaped outline where the destruction had somehow failed to reach. "Oh my," Li said, looking around at the smoking corridor with genuine concern. "That was quite a light show. I hope everyone's okay. These industrial accidents can be so dangerous." The assassins stared in growing horror as Li began walking toward their positions, apparently intent on offering assistance to anyone who might have been hurt by what he assumed was some kind of equipment malfunction. Zarketh was the first to panic. His psychic attack should have reduced Li's mind to mush, but the human seemed completely unaffected. Worse, there was something about Li's mental presence that felt impossibly vast and peaceful, like staring into the calm surface of an ocean that went down forever. In his terror, Zarketh forgot his training and tried to flee. That single moment of movement caught Li's attention, and the human's response was purely instinctive. What Li would later describe to investigators as brushing away what looked like a large bug was actually a casual swatting motion with Aikao, his left hand. The gesture sent Zarketh flying through 4 reinforced bulkheads like a missile, creating perfectly shaped holes in barriers designed to withstand battleship weapons. The psychic assassin disappeared into the next sector with a rapidly fading scream, leaving behind only a Zarketh-shaped tunnel through solid metal. "Oh no!" Li exclaimed, rushing toward the holes with obvious distress. "Someone's been hurt. This is terrible." Silvara, seeing her teammate launched into space, panicked and fired her molecular disruptor at point-blank range. The weapon that could reduce starships to component atoms struck Lee's shoulder and simply shattered like cheap glass against his diplomatic jacket. Lee noticed the broken pieces falling around his feet and immediately knelt down to collect them, his face creased with worry and genuine sadness. "This looks really expensive," he said, carefully gathering the fragments of the most advanced weapon in Silvara's arsenal. "And probably important too. I'm so sorry this got broken in the accident. Do you know who it belongs to? Maybe we can find a repair shop somewhere on the station." Korthman, the shapeshifter, tried to use his natural camouflage to sneak up behind Lee for a close-range strike. The human somehow sensed his approach, later describing it as feeling like someone wanted to give me a hug from behind, and turned around with his arms spread wide in a welcoming gesture. The collision between Lee's friendly embrace and Korthman's assassination attempt resulted in the shapeshifter being compressed into a small, perfectly spherical ball that bounced off 3 walls before coming to rest in a corner, making confused squeaking noises. You all right?" Lee called out to the ball, genuinely concerned. "You don't look well. Should I call medical? Sometimes the artificial gravity on these stations can make people feel dizzy." The remaining assassins watched in absolute terror as their colleagues were systematically and accidentally neutralized by what appeared to be nothing more than Lee's natural reflexes and overwhelming desire to help anyone who seemed to be in distress. When Vexila, the phase-shifting assassin, tried to attack from an impossible angle by emerging from within a solid wall, Lee's surprised flinch sent him flying through the station's outer hull and into the vacuum of space. Lee immediately activated his emergency communicator to request rescue services, apologizing profusely to the space traffic control for the terrible accident. By the time the smoke fully cleared, 9 of the galaxy's most dangerous assassins had been reduced to whimpering, broken beings scattered throughout the industrial sector. 3 survivors abandoned weapons worth more than planetary economies and fled in blind panic, their minds shattered by the impossible sight of raw kindness backed by incomprehensible power. Lee spent the rest of his evening helping coordinate rescue efforts and filling out incident reports, convinced that he'd witnessed some kind of tragic industrial accident that had hurt a lot of innocent bystanders. The first emergency alert went out exactly 17 minutes after the industrial sector incident. It wasn't sent by station security or emergency services. It was transmitted by a panicked Zilarian trade delegate who had witnessed the aftermath through his office window. His message was simple and terrifying. "The human has been activated. Recommend immediate evacuation." Within an hour, that single message had spread through every communication network on Nexus Prime. The station's sophisticated AI system, designed to handle millions of simultaneous conversations, was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of emergency transmissions flooding its circuits. Beings who hadn't spoken to each other in decades were suddenly sharing information about something they were calling the Deathworlder incident. Species that had maintained bitter wars for centuries found themselves united by a common enemy that none of them fully understood. The Krillian High Command, still technically at war with the Nexari Federation, sent an encrypted message offering to share defensive strategies. Ancient rivals began pooling resources and intelligence, all focused on a single terrifying question. What exactly were they dealing with? Station Commander Vex Thalan had overseen Nexus Prime for over 40 years. He'd managed diplomatic crises, prevented 3 different wars, and successfully mediated disputes between species that communicated through entirely different sensory methods. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the reports flooding his desk. 12 of the galaxy's post-dangerous assassins had been neutralized by what appeared to be a single diplomat taking an evening walk. The industrial sector looked like a war zone, with perfectly human-shaped holes punched through reinforced barriers and scorch marks that suggested weapons capable of destroying battleships had been fired repeatedly. Yet somehow, the only casualties were the attackers themselves. Vex Thalan activated the station's highest-level emergency protocols, procedures typically reserved for stellar collapse events or invasion by hostile alien forces. The AI immediately began broadcasting warnings throughout the station. "Attention! Deathworlder agitation detected. All non-essential personnel should seek immediate shelter or evacuation. This is not a drill. The response was immediate and terrifying. Beings who had never agreed on anything suddenly found themselves in perfect harmony about one thing. They needed to get as far away from Li Jin as possible. Shuttle bays filled with evacuees, emergency escape pods launched every few minutes. Some species activated ancient contingency plans that hadn't been used in thousands of years. In the depths of the station's archival sections, ancient races began accessing memory banks that had been sealed for millennia. The elder Vorthak, whose species had existed since before most others had developed space travel, transmitted a message that chilled everyone who received it. Our ancestors spoke of walking disasters from the gravity wells, beings who destroyed entire civilizations through the simple act of trying to help them. The crystalline collective, whose consciousness spanned multiple dimensions, shared ancestral memories that were even more disturbing. Their data described encounters with creatures that brought peace through incomprehensible violence and ended conflicts by accidentally eliminating all participants. Medical teams throughout the station prepared for massive casualties that never came. Instead of treating victims of some terrible attack, they found themselves caring for 9 highly skilled assassins who had somehow been reduced to whimpering, traumatized beings. Each one told the same impossible story. They had attacked a human diplomat with enough firepower to level a city, and he had defeated them all while apologizing and asking if they needed medical attention. What made the situation even more surreal was Li Jin's behavior throughout the crisis. While the entire station buzzed with panic and emergency preparations, the human remained completely oblivious to the chaos he had accidentally caused. He spent his evening visiting the medical bay, bringing flowers and handwritten get-well cards to each of the injured assassins. "I'm so sorry you were hurt in that terrible accident," he told each patient with genuine concern. "Industrial equipment can be so dangerous. I hope you feel better soon." The medical staff watched in fascination and terror as Li chatted pleasantly with beings who had tried to kill him just hours earlier. He asked about their recovery, shared stories about his home planet, and even offered to help them contact their families if they were worried about missing work. Meanwhile, in his temporary quarters, Li was carefully reviewing the next day's negotiation agenda. He made detailed notes about ensuring adequate refreshments for all attending species, cross-referencing dietary requirements and cultural preferences. He was particularly concerned about accommodating the sulfur-breathing delegates and wanted to make sure the environmental controls would keep everyone comfortable. As emergency alerts continued to blare throughout the station and evacuation shuttles departed every few minutes, Li Jin sat peacefully at his desk, humming quietly, while he worked on creating the most welcoming possible environment for tomorrow's peace talks. He had no idea that those peace talks would end up being the fastest diplomatic negotiation in galactic history, with every species desperately eager to sign whatever agreements would keep the humans happy. While the station buzzed with panic and evacuation alerts, Velthak found himself driven by a burning need to understand what he'd gotten himself into. The failed assassination attempt had shattered everything he thought he knew about the universe, and the aftermath had raised even more disturbing questions. Who would pay an astronomical sum to eliminate someone who was apparently indestructible? And why did they want it to look natural when nothing about Li Jin was natural at all? Using his guild access codes and years of experience in tracking information through the galaxy's shadowy networks, Velthak began following the money trail. The contract payment had been routed through 17 different financial institutions across 12 star systems, each transfer designed to hide the original source. But every criminal organization left traces, and Velthak knew how to find them. What he discovered was more terrifying than any single enemy could have been. The assassination contract hadn't been placed by Li Jin's political opponents or rival species seeking to disrupt the peace negotiations. It had been funded by a secret coalition of some of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, species that publicly supported peaceful relations with humanity while privately funding efforts to eliminate them entirely. The intercepted communications Velthak uncovered painted a picture of pure evolutionary terror. These weren't beings driven by hatred or territorial disputes. They were ancient, intelligent species who had survived for millions of years by being very, very careful about potential threats. And their analysis of humanity had led them to a conclusion that chilled Velthak to his bones. They don't understand their own power, read one classified report from the Zeridian High Council. They walk through radiation that would kill us instantly and call it slightly warm. They catch molten metal with their bare hands and apologize for the inconvenience. They survive in environments that we would classify as weapon-grade hostile. Another document, this one from the ancient Vorthak Collective, was even more direct. If humans join the Galactic Council, they will inevitably become the dominant species not through conquest, but through simple durability. They will volunteer for missions that would be suicide for anyone else. They will survive disasters that eliminate entire fleets, and they will do it all while being genuinely friendly and helpful. The most disturbing communication came from a species Velthak had never heard of, being so old and powerful that their very existence was classified at the highest levels. Their message was simple and terrifying. We have seen this before in the deep history that others have forgotten. Species that destroy through kindness, civilizations that end wars by accidentally eliminating all participants. The humans must be contained before they realize what they are. As Velthak absorbed this information, alarms began blaring throughout his section of the station. Not evacuation alarms this time, but the specific tone that indicated critical system failure. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red, as automated voices announced that the main reactor core was experiencing an uncontrolled cascade event. Through his viewport, Velthak could see other ships undocking frantically, fleeing what would soon become a massive explosion that would destroy Nexus Prime and everyone still aboard. The station's AI estimated 12 minutes until total core breach, not enough time for a full evacuation. Then, impossibly, the alarms stopped. The emergency lights switched from red to yellow, then to green. The automated voices announced that the cascade event had been manually resolved and normal operations were resuming. Velthak stared at his instruments in disbelief. You couldn't manually resolve a reactor cascade. It was physically impossible. The energies involved would vaporize anyone who got within 100 meters of the core. The security footage that emerged later would become legendary in engineering circles throughout the galaxy. It showed Li Jin taking his usual evening walk when he paused outside the reactor chamber, tilting his head as if listening to something. "That doesn't sound right," he could be heard saying to himself. Then, with the casual air of someone adjusting a squeaky door, he had walked directly into the reactor chamber. The temperature readings from that room showed levels that should have melted titanium alloy instantly. Radiation detectors registered exposure levels that would have killed most beings in seconds. Yet the footage clearly showed Li Jin reaching into the core containment field with his bare hands and physically realigning the magnetic bottles that contained the fusion reaction. When station engineers interviewed him afterward, Li seemed genuinely puzzled by their excitement. "It was making an odd humming noise," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "I thought maybe something had come loose. It was a bit warm in there, though. I hope I didn't damage my formal attire. I have those important meetings tomorrow." The chief engineer, a being whose species had designed reactor systems for 50,000 years, ran the calculations 3 times before accepting the results. Li Jin had been exposed to enough radiation to kill most life forms instantly, and had survived temperatures that could melt the hull of a battleship. He had manually adjusted equipment that required specialized tools and protective gear, using nothing but his bare hands and common sense. The human filed a polite maintenance request, suggesting that the engineering staff might want to investigate the reactor's unusual noises when they had time, then continued his evening walk, as if he hadn't just prevented the destruction of an entire space station and the deaths of 2 million beings. Velthak closed the files and sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the true scope of what he was dealing with. The coalition of species trying to eliminate humanity wasn't evil. They were terrified. And after seeing what Li Jin could do without even trying, Velthak was beginning to think they might be right to be afraid. The peace negotiations the next morning broke every record in diplomatic history. What should have been weeks of careful discussion, debate, and compromise was completed in exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. The moment Li Jin walked into the conference room, still cheerfully humming and carrying a tray of refreshments, he'd personally prepared for everyone. The atmosphere changed completely. Representatives who had spent decades arguing over single paragraphs of trade agreements suddenly found themselves eager to sign whatever documents were placed in front of them. The Krillian delegation, known for their aggressive negotiation tactics, actually offered to give Earth more favorable terms than Li was asking for. Ancient species that had never agreed on anything in recorded history found themselves nodding enthusiastically at every human suggestion. "We should absolutely establish mutual defense pacts," declared the Nexari ambassador, whose species had previously refused all military alliances. "Earth seems like exactly the kind of friend we want to have." The Crystalline Collective, whose normal communication method involved 3-day telepathic discussions, transmitted their agreement to all proposals within minutes. The Elder Vorthak, who typically spoke in riddles that required teams of linguists to interpret, made their position crystal clear. Whatever the humans want, the humans should have immediately. Li Jin was delighted by everyone's enthusiasm, but slightly puzzled by how quickly things were moving. He'd prepared detailed presentations about Earth's agricultural exports and mineral resources, complete with holographic displays and sample products. Instead, he found himself signing comprehensive treaties that covered everything from trade to cultural exchange to mutual protection agreements. "You're all so wonderfully cooperative," Li said during a brief recess, genuinely touched by the warm reception. "I was worried that Earth, being so new to galactic politics, might make these discussions difficult, but everyone's been incredibly welcoming and friendly." What Li interpreted as diplomatic enthusiasm was actually a room full of beings desperately trying to ensure that humanity would never have any reason to be upset with their species. The Zalarian trade minister had quietly authorized his delegation to offer Earth-exclusive mining rights to 3 entire star systems. The sulfur-breathing delegates had already drafted proposals for joint research programs that would give humans access to their most advanced technologies. By noon, every species present had signed comprehensive agreements that were far more generous to Earth than anything they'd ever offered to each other. The final ceremony was conducted with remarkable speed, with representatives practically fighting each other to be the first to shake Li's hand and welcome Earth to the galactic community. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the ripple effects of the Nexus Prime incident were reshaping entire industries. The Galactic Assassins Guild held an emergency meeting that lasted 3 days and resulted in the most significant policy change in their history. Velthak, despite his failure, was promoted to senior consultant and tasked with developing new guidelines for what they were now calling impossible targets. The new guild policy was elegant in its simplicity. Effective immediately, all contracts involving humans or other Deathworlder species are classified as existential threat scenarios and are hereby banned. Guild members who encounter such beings during operations are authorized to implement immediate strategic withdrawal protocols. This is not considered a failure of mission. This is considered basic survival instinct. Velthak's retirement from active assassination was surprisingly easy. He'd saved enough money from his long career, and the trauma of facing Li Jin had left him with no desire to ever kill again. Instead, he established what would become the galaxy's most successful consulting firm, Deathworlder Safety Solutions. His first client was the Guild itself, which hired him to redesign their training facilities to be human-compatible. This involved rebuilding structures with materials that could actually contain beings who casually shattered military-grade barriers and developing new protocols for operations in systems where humans might be present. Word of Velthak's expertise spread quickly through the criminal underworld. Within months, he was consulting for mercenary companies, pirate organizations, and even legitimate security firms. His most popular seminar, Understanding Deathworlders, Why Genuine Kindness, backed by incomprehensible durability, is the galaxy's most dangerous force, was attended by representatives from hundreds of species. The seminar's key message was simple but revolutionary. Traditional threat assessment methods are useless when dealing with Deathworlders. They don't follow normal patterns of aggression or self-preservation. They will walk into situations that would kill us instantly and consider it a nice day out. They will survive attacks that would destroy battleships and respond by asking if the attackers need medical attention. The only winning strategy is not to play. Li Jin returned to Earth completely unaware of the galaxy-wide changes his diplomatic mission had triggered. His report to the Earth Council was glowing with enthusiasm about humanity's reception among the stars. He described species after species as surprisingly eager to establish friendly relations and recommended immediate expansion of Earth's diplomatic corps. "I think we have a real talent for this," Li wrote in his final report. "Everyone seems genuinely excited to work with us. Several civilizations even offered us exclusive trade deals and defense partnerships without us asking. I believe humans have a natural ability to inspire cooperation and bring out the best in other species." The Earth Council approved Li's recommendations unanimously, authorizing dozens of new diplomatic missions throughout the galaxy. They had no idea they were accidentally launching the most effective expansion of human influence in galactic history. Throughout known space, the lesson had been learned: never underestimate a species that considers surviving on a death world normal, and whose idea of diplomacy involves accidentally intimidating entire civilizations into enthusiastic cooperation. The age of human galactic diplomacy had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.